First of all, welcome everybody. And I want to start this evening's session of essayists on essays by extending some thanks. First of all, to all of you for coming and for joining us. To the IES for hosting, to Eleanor Hardy for all her hard work in putting this together and distributing invitations and accepting your requests for a place here. And also to our speakers, of course. We are absolutely delighted that our dream roster of speakers accepted our invitations to speak on this occasion. And I think the number of people who are currently entering this Zoom room testify to your manifold attractions. Tommy and I began talking about this book, which we are celebrating this evening, on essays, Montaigne to the Present. We began talking about it in approximately 2009 and initially thought it would be about maybe 5 years in the making. And some of you contributors who are here will remember our initial prognosis of when the book would be done. But like all things essayistic, it changed and it morphed, and it has ended up being somewhere very different from what we conceived in 2009. Montaigne says famously at the beginning of Repentance, "I do not portray being, I portray passing, not the passing from one age to another, or as the people say, from 7 years to 7 years, but from day to day, from minute to minute." And there have been an awful lot of minutes and days and years between the first thinking of this book and where we are now, its publication. And given what has happened in the last 18 months, I think it feels as if we've moved from ages into different ages as well. So the book came out in hardback form in the summer of 2020, and we promised ourselves we'd have a launch in person as soon as possible, and it still doesn't seem entirely possible. And so this occasion is the celebration of the launch of the paperback edition, which came out this summer. Readers of Montaigne's essays will know that modern editions tend to indicate the different stratigraphy of the process of Montaigne's composition by superscript alphabetical letters or by numbers, which indicate the different layers of revision that went into the book. If we had had a similar system for on essays, then we would have needed the whole alphabet and then most of the numbers as well to indicate the very many different layers of work that went into it. And my final and most fervent vote of thanks is to all of our contributors, several of whom I can see are here today, who were immensely patient with our various editorial interventions, who produced such rich and vivid and distinct essays on all kinds of topics, from the long miscellaneous history of the essay to the present day, although what I would say is it's the present day as was maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, and it seems that the essay has already transformed into something totally different since we submitted our book. It takes you through libraries, shoe shops, tea shops, coffee shops, periodicals, novels, city streets, smoking houses, video screens, lots and lots of different places. And the fact that the book ends with video screens seems appropriate given that we are here all in this virtual space. It is also, like all things essayistic, incomplete, partial, and a gesture towards potential fullness. And we are aware that there are many other volumes of essays on essays emergent within the last couple of years and coming in the next couple of years. Some of the editors of whom I can see amongst the assembled faces here today. You are also very welcome. Many of you are contributors to those volumes. And it's just exciting to be part of such a kind of vivid efflorescence of essays and essays upon essays, and no doubt at some point essays upon essays upon essays, as Hilaire Belloc has already written. I'll pass over to Tommy, my co-editor. Tommy, you're mute.
I'm going to thank you to Katie, and it'd be a good moment to thank Katie for her work as co-editor, and to say that we had a lot of fun and a lot of hardship and a lot of squabbles along the way, but we finally got there. So I'm very pleased to see this event here. And thank you all very much for coming. We've got 170 people logging into this online event, and after 18 months of COVID and people being pretty sick of online events. I think that's a tribute to the interest of the essay now. I've got a few technical things to mention. I've been asked to ask you to please keep your microphone on mute in the event until you're called on to ask a question. There will be live automatic transcription. And if you want to switch that off, you can do so by clicking on captions at the bottom of your screen and then select hide subtitles. Note that the chat will not be open during the presentations. About an hour in, after the roundtable, the chat will be turned on and you'll be invited to post questions to the speakers. And Katie will be running a Q&A for that second hour. And we'll select questions and invite people to unmute and ask their questions if they want to. And if they don't want to, she can ask for them. But we're not using the hand function because there are too many attendants, which is a very nice tribute to the interest of the subject. I recommend that you switch to speaker view in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And after a couple of minutes into the event, if you switch your videos off, it will help with the bandwidth of the event. Obviously, when you're asking a question, you might want to switch it on. I'm going to encourage people, if they're interested, to use the very nice discount code, which OUP have given us, which reduces the book from £20 to a snip at £14. There is the discount code, which is now in the chat at the bottom of the screen. Don't try to buy it using Chrome, because the OUP website doesn't work on Chrome. Doesn't work on Chrome. So you need to log in with Firefox or Safari onto the OUP website to be able to buy the book with that discount. It now falls to me to introduce the chair of our roundtable, which is an honor, Hermione Lee, who is a celebrated biographer of a range of writers, including Penelope Fitzgerald, Edith Wharton, Virginia Woolf, and most recently Tom Stoppard, and has been for many years a prominent critic and essayist. She was president of Wolfson College, Oxford from 2008 to 2017, and the Goldsmiths Professor of English Literature at Oxford from 1998 to 2008. She's a fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Society of Literature, and a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And in 2013, she was made a Dame for services to literary scholarship. So we're extremely grateful to Hermione for agreeing to chair the event. Delight for me because she was my PhD supervisor, which was a great honor. And of course, as Katie said, we're extremely grateful to our very distinguished speakers. So I'm now going to hand over to Hermione.
Thank you, Tommy. I'm delighted to be chairing the celebration of this excellent and important collection. And I'd like to start by paying tribute to the volumes, to editors and conveners of today's events, who you've already met. Tommy Carson, who's Associate Professor of Literature at the University of East Anglia, expert on modernism and on American English and Russian literature, especially Nabokov, and Catherine Murphy, Associate Professor of English at Oxford, Fellow of Oriel College and specialist in the Renaissance, currently working on Robert Burton and on metaphysical prose. In the prologue to the volume, which they nicely called On the Difficulty of Introducing a Work of This Kind, they describe the essay as a form, I quote, which allows for both detachment and political force, for serious attention to ephemeral details of life and culture, and for the improvisational hazarding of judgments, arguments, and ideas. The essay, they add, creates a space in which otherwise disparate genres and conversations can mix. Experience and learning enrich one another, and the specialized learning and experimental artistic forms of universities and avant-gardes find or even form a general readership and grow there. I think that description would be of interest to the three notable speakers on our panel today, and I'd like to introduce them in neutrally alphabetical order. Brian Dillon is Professor and Director of Creative Writing at Queen Mary, University of London, and a memoirist, curator, editor, and essayist. Recent works include a book of essays on literary sentences, Suppose a Sentence, and a volume which mixes autobiographical and critical essays in pieces, writing on art, etc. Jeff Dolven is professor in the Department of English at the University of Princeton and the founding director of Princeton's interdisciplinary doctoral program in the humanities. He's a poet, critic, editor, and essayist who has written widely on the Renaissance, on poetry and poetics, on music, pedagogy, and style. Merve Imre is Associate Professor of American Literature at Oxford University and Fellow of Worcester College. She's the author of essays, criticism, editions, and books on bad and good readers, on literature and its audiences, on personality testing, on Elena Ferrante, on Virginia Woolf, on criticism, and on the humanities. All three are well-known, genre-bending, highly original teachers and writers who cross the borders between imaginative and critical work, as the best essayists often do. Our three speakers are going to talk about the essay, read a bit possibly, and talk a bit about what they've drawn from this book. The suggestion from the editors was that they might concentrate on one particular image that they've noticed running through the collection, but if we don't get to that in the first presentations, we might get to that later. My job is to keep time, which goes against the spirit of essay writing's open-endedness, described in the book by Stefano Evangelista as a process of exploration, hesitation, loitering, meandering, and revisiting. There might be some of that today, but I will also be bearing in mind Adam Phillips' note that in reading an essay, we know the end is always near. So I will be bringing the three speakers in around the 10-minute mark so that we have time to have a roundtable with us and the editors. And after that, as Tommy said, the virtual floor will be open for questions from contributors and attendees. So I'd like to ask Brian Dillon, if you'd like to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hermione, and thank you, Katie and Thomas, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I think I first heard about the anthology on essays at the launch of my own book, Essayism, and I remember being petrified by the idea that I had entered in my own amateurish way onto a field that was so rich in scholarship, and that I was about to be proved precisely an amateur, and so it has proved. It's an incredibly rich, detailed and suggestive and wide-ranging book. Katie and Thomas have, as Hermione says, invited us to perhaps kind of pursue a particular aspect or image from the volume that has taken us, that has held us in our first readings of it. And I thought I might actually begin at the end of the book with Christy Wampole's piece, which is titled Dali's Montaigne, Essay Hybrids and Surrealist Practice. And it's a really fascinating essay on, first of all, it starts from a particular edition of Montaigne from 1947 with illustrations by Salvador Dali. And if you have the book, you'll recall this amazing picture reproduced in Christy Wampole's piece of Dali's rendering of Montaigne's thumbs from the essay on thumbs. And Christy Wampole's argument in this piece is about what she calls the compatibility of surrealism and essayism as expressive, image-reliant forms. And she goes on to describe, under the kind of rubric or aegis or image of surrealism, the ways in which certain artists and writers, notably Walker Evans and James Agee, in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men from 1941, Chris Marker, the great film essayist, in particular in his 1982 film Sans Soleil, and the video art of John Breslin, that this work elaborates what Wampole calls a hybrid form, the essay hybrid that brings together text and image in various fashions, in various ways, whether that's on the page or on the screen. Christy Wampole writes, the introduction of a visual element to essayistic practices in the 20th century in the form of photograph, film, and video, allowed the essay hybrid to remain suspended in an interstitial space between the documentary and the dream world. And I think I want to kind of think about that space, the space between documentary and dream, because it seems to me an extraordinarily pertinent, apt way to describe how I think about not just a kind of the essay as an object of knowledge for me as a critic, but a certain kind of mood or feeling that seems very familiar to me in my own approach to essay writing. Walpole talks about what she calls latent tendencies in the essay tradition. Image-centered tableau, she writes, were always a key feature in the essay. And I think there's a couple of things. There's at least two things, possibly three, going on in this piece at the end of the book. One of them is about essays that are made of images or that accompany, whose text is accompanied by images. One of them, however, is something to do with the essayist somehow aspiring to be an image, to take the form of an image. And the other, of course, is the way in which the essay uses imagery, uses the figural, uses image, metaphor, allegory, and so on. And I thought this was an incredibly suggestive piece for me. And one of the things it made me return to was a question about my own kind of small canon of my most beloved essayists, and the ways in which they seem really oddly attached to photography and photographs. And the names here will be blindingly obvious. Essayists and critics like Walter Benjamin, Roland Barthes, John Berger, Susan Sontag, Janet Malcolm, whose very first book is about photography, Wayne Kestenbaum, and you can think of many others, including Teju Cole, Jeff Dyer, and so on. So there's a question, why are these essayists from roughly the early 20th century onwards so obsessed by, so interested in photography? The answer is blindingly obvious to some degree. It is that photography has transformed, has utterly changed how these writers suspended between documentary and dream, can even begin to think about their job, to think about representation. And I go back, for example, to De Quincey, writing in 1845 on the first page of his Suspiria de Profundis, where he talks about, he says, the brain is haunted as if by some jealousy of ghostly beings moving amongst us. And there's a beautiful footnote, and the footnote says simply, daguerreotype, etc. So the photograph is this image of something having happened to the world around him. Or I think about Woolf in her great essay on the cinema in 1926, watching the cabinet of Dr. Caligari and spotting a strange tadpole-shaped shadow in the corner. And this shadow wanders about the screen for maybe a split second, but it does something monstrous to the way that she sees the screen. And it seems to me that in this kind of canon that we might begin to constellate of essays and essayists invested in photography, there are three types, there are three things happening. One of them is the critical attention to the photograph. Again, Sontag, Benjamin, Barthes, Berger, Janet Malcolm, and so on. The second would be something like the essay alongside photography. And this completely overlaps with the first list. The great books written and made by John Berger and the Swiss photographer Jean Moore in the 60s and 70s and beyond. The work of Chris Marker, the essayistic strand in a writer like W.G. Sebald, contemporary essay artists, rather, like Sophie Calle and Moira Davey. The third would be something slightly different and more mysterious and more vexing. And it's something to do with this aspiration or desire on the part of the essay to become like a photograph. And you can see it in a sense of like precision in a writer like Janet Malcolm, but the weirder, stranger version of it would be something like Benjamin's dialectical image The idea that an essay could be made, as it were, of snapshots. It could be made of these moments of sudden insight, and that the job of the essayist is to set these things alongside each other, as if in an album, as if on a gallery wall. And I think this is the big claim that's going on in Christy Wampole's piece at the end of the book. I know, as a writer, as an essayist, that I learned to write essays. I learned to write about what we might call life, the world, by writing about images. My training is in literature, but I learned to write about the stuff of life, about things, about people, about bodies, about places, by writing about photographs. And I wonder what that knowledge, what that learning is. It's something, it's possibly the only thing that I share with Joan Didion, who started her career as an essayist, as a trainee at Vogue, writing captions, writing photograph captions. And we might remember Benjamin's great passages in the 1930s about the place of the caption in contemporary media and in contemporary life. Didion wrote captions, and I'm going to share my screen very briefly here, for fashion photographs, for features. Here she is in the issue of Vogue for the 1st of August, 1965, in a feature on the home of Dennis Hopper and Brooke Hayward, his wife, also an actor. And here is Didion's caption to this piece, or a set of captions. To visit the Hopper house is to be, at every turn, surprised, freshly beguiled by a kaleidoscopically shifting assemblage of found objects, loved objects, objets d'art. Didion says in a piece from the late 70s that this is how she learned to write. And her editor, Aline Talmey, who was editor, or was directly Didion's editor at that point at Vogue in the mid-60s, said, with these captions, we wrote along and we published short. And that's how Joan learned to write. And I'm going
to ask you to come to a conclusion.
I'm going to give you one tiny final quotation from Didion. And this is from 76. In a piece she wrote called Why I Write for the New York Times. She said that you have a picture in your mind as a writer, as an essayist, and the picture dictates the arrangement. The picture dictates how you write. It makes your language, and it makes the structure of your language. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Jeff.
Thank you, Hermione. And thanks to everyone. And nice to see so many friends and people whose essays I admire in the audience. And a theme from this wonderful book that I was thinking about is memory. There are a few, Ned Stuckey French's essay, Michael Wood's, Adam Phillips, a few others touch on questions of the essay as memory and remembering essays. And I'm interested in the antagonism between the essay and memory. And so I want to make a few remarks using the traditional early modern odd couple of Montaigne and Bacon. And if you consult the index of on essays, it's clear you can't go 20 pages in the book without meeting Montaigne, and Bacon is in there a lot too, especially in Katie's wonderful Sticks and Stones essay at the start, but really throughout. So I want to think about their legacy of forgetting. You could say in the largest sense, one way of dividing up the kinds of writing is to consider how they offer themselves to the memory. So if you take the novel, you can hang on to everything. You can hang everything on its story, recall of episodes and of atmospheres, depending on what happens next and next and next. Verse teases you with the idea, at least, that you might get everything by heart, prompts of meter and rhyme to jog you along. And if recitation fails, then verse still offers abstractions of form, like the structure of a sonnet, where you can lodge particular remembered lines. In the case of discursive prose, form is going to be less help, but any writing with an argument has the architecture of its claims and its evidence, and even the steps of a proof. And all of these kinds are constructed according to rules of composition, which are also economies of recollection, ways of holding writing together in the mind and then bringing it back again when you need it. So narrative, prosodic rhythm, spatial form, argument, they all serve the memory. What about the essay then in that landscape? What are its mnemonic affordances beyond its customary brevity? It's tempting to say, or at least I'm tempted to say that it has none or none special to itself, and moreover that its refusal to make itself convenient to memory is among its defining properties. So that's something that Montaigne is candid about. I'm so outstanding a forgetter, he says, that along with all the rest, I forget even my own works and writings. Against such claims, you have to weigh the fact that he remembers an enormous amount of stuff himself, quotations, citations, etc., even if he doesn't always fess up to where they come from. But his characteristic wanderings and digressions defy prediction and defy recollection alike. Of the Cannibals is a famously vagrant meditation on the natives of the Americas and on who looks like a barbarian to whom. It canvasses traditional topoi of valor and cruelty as a formal oration might, but the connections as it goes are metonymic rather than metaphoric. That's to say they're local associations from link to link of a chain, report and travel narrative and bits of Seneca and bits of Virgil, rather than coordinated expressions of a governing conceit. And Of the Cannibals ultimately arrives at a scene that would serve in the hands of another writer as a powerful narrative climax, the meeting of three indigenous Americans with Charles IX of France at Rouen in 1562. And someone in the French party asks a very Montaignian question: what has most amazed the visitors about France? And in answer, they made 3 points. They're surprised that the boy king, Charles, then 12 years old, should command the allegiance of all these bearded men. They're surprised that the destitute of France don't rise up against the rich. And 3, I'm very annoyed with myself for not remembering the third, says Montaigne, and goes on. He does ask them about the privileges of rank, and he learns that a commander will have men to cut a path ahead of him through the forest wherever he goes. Not at all bad, that, says Montaigne. And he adds, but they wear no breeches. They don't wear pants, these people. And that's how the essay ends, offhanded and careless, as though it stopped bothering to remember itself, stopped remembering what it cares about, stopped reading itself. It's a memorable ending, of course, but not because it sets the capstone in an arch. It's the abruptness of its abdication and its indifference to what went before. That's what sticks. Bacon, very different. I read Montaigne as he revised his own essays. He sounds a lot more like a proper early modern orator or preacher. And here's how his essay Of Anger sets out. We will first speak how the natural inclination and habit to be angry may be attempered and calmed. Secondly, how the particular motions of anger may be repressed or at least refrained from doing mischief. Thirdly, how to raise anger or appease anger in another. So instead of the wayfaring perspective of the Montaignian essay, best seen from wherever you happen to be along its path, Bacon begins with a view from above. And it's tempting to treat such self-conscious architectures as evidence of a method. But Bacon was at least as worried as an essayist and elsewhere as a scientist about how structures of formal rhetoric might preempt the articulation of new phenomenon. And his remedy is the aphorism. Aphorisms begin his essays. He that hath wife and children hath given hostages to fortune. They end essays. For when things once come to the execution, there is no secrecy comparable to celerity. It's a great one. Or they erupt in the middle. There is no excellent beauty that hath not some strangeness in the proportion. Bacon loves the aphorism's autonomy, its ability to stand alone, and more than that, its resistance to assimilation by context. For discourse of illustration is cut off by the aphorism, he says. Recitals of example are cut off, discourse of connection and order is cut off. The aphorism is cut off, that is, from the prejudices, forejudgments built into the conventional orders of discourse. And the essay that results is not a wandering line like Montaigne's, lubricated with apology. It's more a scattering of points for us to connect, or even a blast of shot. We may remember the aphorisms, but I think we remember them at the expense of the essay. the ancients, he tells us, have paid too much attention to memory, and they've neglected the thinking faculty. For he who remembers or recollects thinks. He who imagines thinks, he who reasons thinks. And in a word, the spirit of man, whether prompted by sense or left to itself, whether in the functions of the intellect or of the will and affections, dances to the tune of the thoughts. Great line. The essayist has a responsibility to a thinking that does not run along the channels of persuasion, a responsibility to refuse familiar economies of form, for they ordain their own conclusions. Thinking is an invaluable enemy of memory. And even though Bacon loves a premeditated structure, his essays are disrupted by aphorism from within. Remembering just how you got to that jeweled maxim means that you've failed to cut it off or to cut it free. So it helps in vivifying some of the critical commonplaces that the essay is an attempt, that it's preliminary, that it's subjective, to recognize that at any moment in its history, recognize what in any moment of its history it pushes off against, where it has to win its aimless freedom and the sources of its potential shame. It's not an oration. It's not a sermon. The economies of memory that structure those kinds of writing are equally economies of expectation. And they allow experienced listeners and readers to receive the version they want to remember even the first time they hear it. Montaigne, in different ways, and here connecting with some of what Brian has said, they rely upon the individual sentence and the relatively weak, or at least contingent, bond of one sentence to the next over the strong vertical control of an argument or a narrative. If we therefore find it difficult to reconstruct an essay, to map it as we might an argument or plot, our forgetting is not the strong Nietzschean kind clearing the way for heroic self-assertion. The essayist's forgetting, or the essay reader's forgetting, is rather an effect of the essay's insistence on being an experience that you have as you read, rather than one that you've already had, let alone one that you remember before you begin. And to protect that experience, to defeat the hungry anticipations of memory, the essay must make some sacrifices of form. Nice one. Do I have a moment to say one more thing about it?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So I don't want to say that essays are forgettable, but they do require a different account of relation to memory. And I've been thinking, and partly at Katie's prompting, it's a book that appears a couple of times in this volume about Brian Blanchfield's collection of essays. They all begin this book, Proxies, permitting shame, error, and guilt, myself the single source. They have a little mantra that says, I'm working from my memory here and only my memory. And in his essay on dossiers, he writes, and this I did remember without looking it up, something like, why do we say brought to mind? Why do we say the brought and brought to mind when sent might be the better word? And there's a dream of the owl in this essay, a dream of an owl that comes in to answer this question as though it might be about sending dreams to ourselves. And I don't remember how he got to that. And I would have to reread or re-experience the essay. And I do wonder, and this is my last thought, I do wonder if Blanchfield himself, but I think only Blanchfield could do it, if Blanchfield himself could rewrite the essay and how far before I could say for sure that he had done so.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Merve.
Thank you, Hermione. Thank you, Katie and Tommy, for inviting me. Katie, I kept telling you that OUP wasn't sending me copies, and then they sent me like 5. So if anyone wants an extra, I'll sell it to you for £13 and undercut the publisher's price. So the term that struck me is actually one that doesn't appear in your index. And I was surprised to find that it didn't appear there. It is the term personal. And while we have personae in there, we do not have the term personal. And anyone who circulates in contemporary media or publishing today cannot do so without encountering debates about the personal essay. And to me, what it brought to mind was this line from Adorno's The Essayist Form that I can't shake, where he writes, the essay form, however, bears some responsibility for the fact that bad essays tell stories about people instead of elucidating the matter at hand. And so it was interesting to me how speaking of the personal essay is to speak of a genre that is difficult to define, but easy to denounce. The offending element is rarely the essay as a form, it passes unscathed, but its content, the personal, a permanent temptation for a form whose suspiciousness of false profundity does not protect it from turning into slick superficiality, writes Adorno. A list of antonyms to the personal essay might include more admirable imaginary genres like the structural essay, the communal essay, the public essay, the critical essay, and the impersonal essay. Or as Adorno insinuates, simply the good essay, which prioritizes elucidating the matter at hand instead of telling stories about people. So what makes essays that tell stories about people bad? For Adorno, as for Walter Benjamin, whom Adorno names as his favorite essayist, essays about people betray the true object of essayistic criticism, which is the private individual. The private individual is not a particular person with a particular story to tell, no matter how distinctive, original, or purely bizarre that story may be. The private individual is not a proper name, not Virginia Woolf or Elizabeth Hardwick or Joan Didion or Zadie Smith or whomever it is you consider your favorite personal essayist to be. Rather, it's the idea that animates all these figures, the powerful and unobtrusive concept that gives the personal essay the appearance of ventriloquizing a singular and spontaneous subjectivity. The private individual is the ideological apparatus that authorizes the genre's first-person address, the I that posits itself as both the subject and the object of its own understanding. Most essayists and scholars who write about the personal essay agree that its I is by necessity and choice an artful construction. Watch, they say, as it flickers in and out of focus as a simulacrum, a chameleon, a made-up self, a distorting representation of the individual from whose consciousness it originates and whose being it registers. Yet having marveled at its aesthetic flexibility and freedom, few critics put this claim through its dialectical paces. What if individual subjectivity were as much a fiction as the I with which it so prettily speaks? What if stressing the artifice of the first person were a strategy for masking the personal essay's problematic, the internal limitations on what its author can and cannot say? What if the conceptual limitation of the genre were its interpolation of reader and writer into the ideological process of individualism, its glittering veneer of expressive freedom, of speaking and writing as a self-determining subject? And what if no performance of stylish confession or sly concealment could shake this ideology loose? To answer these questions about the personal essay, its mode of address, and the private individual that enlivens both requires a biography of sorts, though not a personal one. The biographer could be any of the 20th century theorists who have heralded the entrance of individual subjectivity into history, but it is Benjamin who emerges as the thinker most interested in its literary aesthetics and its relation to the essay, I think. According to Benjamin, the private individual was conceived sometime between 1830 and 1848 during the reign of Louis Philippe, the first bourgeois monarch. Under his rule, the European ruling classes, oh no, hold on, my Mac is about to sleep soon unless plugged into a power outlet. Hold on, so I do not disappear on you. Under his rule, the European ruling classes and the middle class came together to realize their defining goal, the separation of the public from the private domain, where, as Marx observes, the bourgeoisie could retreat to rejoice in property, family, religion, and order. Once labor had been cordoned off from life, once the productive activity of work had been separated from the supposedly unproductive experience of dwelling, the private individual was born. The domestic sphere was his incubator, his sanctuary from commercial and social considerations. There he could retreat wide-eyed and mewling to probe what he believed to be his thoughts, lodged in his self, his mind, his body, his home. For Benjamin, the best representative of the private individual was the collector of decorative objects, the true resident of the interior. For us, it might be the personal essay collection, which props up the same ideology. One of the things that I want to accomplish in my comments today is just to trace very, very broadly how the personal essay's historic and aesthetic function has been to persuade us not just that personhood is beautiful or good, but that it is primordial, that individual subjectivity and its expression exist prior to the social formations that gave rise to it. This is a lie, the lie that subtends bourgeois individualism and all its intrusions into language, art, and education, as Adorno explains. And he writes, quote, "The lie extends from the elevation of historical concepts and historical languages to primal words, to academic instruction in creative writing, and to primitiveness pursued as a handicraft, to recorders and finger paintings in which pedagogical necessity acts as though it were metaphysical virtue. The personal essay in its various guises, and it's always the college admissions essay in the US that comes to mind when I think about this, which you guys mentioned in your introduction, appears as the purest and most unflinching aesthetic expression of this lie, for the simple reason that for an essay to qualify as personal in the first place, the primacy of the private individual must be presupposed. By this account, the personal essay is a modern formation and a formation of modernity. And it's interesting that the descriptor personal essay began to spread through the English lexicon roughly around 1905, which is the same year that Woolf publishes her essay on the decline of essay writing. The essays from earlier centuries that are retroactively designated as personal, for instance, in anthologies like Philip Lopate's The Personal Essay, were commonly referred to as familiar essays prior to that. And Felicity James's essay in this collection does a really wonderful job exploring the dynamics of familiarity. So I'm just going to draw out a couple of those in the moments I have left. The antonyms of the familiar essay were didactic, factual, informative, or instructive essays. The familiar essay made no claims about the autobiographical nature of its content. It seldom treated the author as its object of interest. Rather, familiarity concerned the relationship projected between the essay's writer and its reader, which was a relationship between friends. And always this friendship was mediated by the presence of an object to which the writer had committed her powers of perception and analysis, and through it secured her reader's interest. A novel or a painting, a historical figure like Cato, a creature like a moth. And the familiar essay unfolded by creating a scene of triangulation between the essayist, her reader, and the object that now shared their attention. Quote, "One might put it thus," writes Christopher Morley in the 1921 anthology Modern Essays, "that the perfection of the familiar essay is a conscious revelation of self done inadvertently." And I should say one of those inadvertent techniques is what I think all of the other panelists write so beautifully about elsewhere, which is style. By contrast, the personal essay distinguished itself from the beginning by its failure to maintain this practice of triangulation, its unwillingness to commit to inadvertency, its directness, its overtness. It indulged the temptation to, quote, "fall into monologue," Morley complained, allowing its language to curdle into disclosures that were, quote, "too ostentatiously quaint, too deliberately whimsical." And then in parentheses, he writes, "whimsical, the word which by loathsome repetition has become emetic." As many of the composition textbooks from the early 20th century recognized, direct address could not be avoided entirely. It was inherent in the use of the first person. Yet its influence on the overall scene of essay writing and reading could be minimized, made to harmonize with competing forms of address that were more depersonalized in the kind of friendship that they imagined, indeed that held impersonality to be a sign of the essay's aesthetic and ethical success. "It has seemed to me lately more possible than I know to carry a friendship greatly on one side without due correspondence on the other," wrote Emerson in On Friendship, his essay concerning the poetics of familiarity. The asymmetry in the exchange of words between writer and reader was not to be lamented. It was to be celebrated for mediating sociality through the cultivated idiosyncrasy of prose. The higher the style we demand of friendship, of course, the less easy to establish it with flesh and blood, Emerson concluded. This was a difficulty to be welcomed, forcing relationality away from face-to-face situations of address and dispersing it across a vast, indefinite public. To write an essay in a conspicuously marked style was to labor to convert one's personality into prose, canceling the thick walls of individual character, relation, age, sex, and circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mervyn. I think it's remarkable that without conferring, we've had 3 such interestingly various mini essays on essays, one on the image and the photograph, one on memory and forgetting, and one on the personal and the familiar. And in a way, all 3 have to do with style, of course, and with form. Merve's presentation was reminding me at one point of the curious thing that Virginia Woolf says in the modern essay in 1922, which is that the challenge, she describes the challenge of the essay writer as never to be yourself and yet always. And that phrase haunts me, actually, when thinking about the essay. So I think if we can maybe go on for perhaps 20 minutes or so, with the six of us involved, I thought it might be nice if we all unmute ourselves boldly. If the editors might want first, Tommy or Katie, to respond to anything that struck you between the eyes in these three presentations.
I have a couple of thoughts I can start with and then hand over to Tommy. First of all, I was struck with how wonderful they were. Thank you. And as Hermione has already said, the kind of essayistic qualities that you brought out in your own writing. I was thinking as you were speaking of ways to try and bring the three of you together, and also to think about questions that were emerging for me. And one of them, as Brian was talking about the relationship between the essay and photography, I was thinking about if we are to read an essay as a photograph, might we take on board Barthes' distinction between the studium and the punctum? So the kind of the ongoing kind of general process of what an essay is ostensibly about, or rather a photograph is ostensibly about, versus the single piercing moment that has a kind of idiosyncratic grasp on one. And this is, I was partly thinking about this because I think about this and thinking about essays, Montaigne's essays especially, the difference between the kind of aphoristic, puncticular, excerptable moment and the ongoing kind of process. And you'll see the ways in which the moment Jeff started to talk about memory, I started to think and talk about aphorism, I started to think exactly about that kind of excerptable relationship. And then
Katie, do you want to pause there, because that's such a good point in itself. See if Tommy wants to come in at this point, and then we'll come back to you, and the speakers might want to respond. Tommy.
Acceptable relationship. I mean, I suppose I don't really have. I mean, there were three such wonderful papers. I don't have a particular comment in response, but I keep, as so often, wondering how many of the things we say about the essay can so often be said about particular kinds of novels. As Jeff said, often in novels we have a plot to hang our memory on, but often not. I can never remember what happens in the Alice books, when or where. So, there are kinds of episodic fiction which exempt themselves from that kind of rememberable structure in the way novels do. And I think quite a lot of what Merv said could be said about certain sorts of novels. So that's really a question for the three speakers, is how much of what they said could be said about certain kinds of novels.
Okay, I had one question too, which was not something I think that's been specifically referenced, although it came up in the treatment of Montaigne and ideas about other culture. I happened to be reading The Guardian today, and there was a review of a new book of essays by Teju Cole, which Brian, you mentioned earlier. It's a volume called Black Paper, and it's a review by Sunikai Chikudu, and he says this: I see it as fitting that Teju Cole uses lyric essays, he uses that phrase, uses lyric essays to write about dark times. For me, that form's beauty, its hope and its power lie in its lack of rigidity, its defiance of preconceived notions. And I was very struck, I was thinking about essays all day, very struck about that as a way of praising the fluidity of the essay form as a political tool, as a potential political tool, as a way to write about politics. So that was something else I just wanted to throw into the mix. I don't know if one of the three speakers would like to come back to Katie or Tommy's questions. Brian.
I wonder, this is really a bad idea, but I'm going to try and answer all three questions at once. Because it seems to me, in my turn, some of you having seen connections between our three short presentations, I see something that's linking all three of these questions. Katie's question about, or reminder of, this notion of a kind of excerptability of the aphoristic within the essay, for example. Thomas's question about the novel, and now Hermione, your question about the lyric and politics. All the while the others were speaking, I was being reminded at various points of something to do with the lightness of the essay. And if in some way what I was trying to talking about photography was something to do with the essay and light, surely there is also historically, but also maybe fundamentally as well, some aspect of the essay that is about lightness. This is often thought about in terms of subject matter. You know, the essay attends to small things, or it's thought about in terms of tone or style. The essay tends to the frivolous in its voice. But there's surely also something to do with an idea of the essay's varying commitment, which might be aesthetic or personal. It might also be political. I'm reminded of, I think somewhere Barthes talks about admiring political beliefs lightly held. And I wonder if, I can only speak for myself in this, but when I think about the form, the genre of the essay, do I really believe in it, having written a book about it? To what extent do I believe in it? Maybe I hold to this form lightly, in the way that Calvino, for example, speaks about lightness as a kind of key modern value in literature. And I wonder if there is something in this idea of lightness that has to do with, as much to do with the politics of the essay and the potential of forms like the lyric that seem to be aesthetic, detached from the political, has just as much to do with politics as it does with an idea of the kind of frivolous voice, you know, speaking on and on, pointing to itself, etc.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Yeah, Merve, did you want to come back on that, or?
The only thing I would say is that I actually do not find it very useful to speak about the essay as a form, but I do find it useful to historicize what the essay means at different moments, and that I find easiest to do through genre, because generic terms seem to be the ones that people use most forcefully when they're talking about what they imagine both the aesthetic and the political project of the essay is supposed to be. So I have no real investment in claiming that there are any real formal properties that one can point to say this is that the essay is defined along the axis of form. I'm not really sure what that gets you exactly.
Would you ever want to talk about it in terms of usefulness?
Maybe. I mean, Tommy's question was interesting. And before we started the event, right, we were having a conversation about how so many contemporary novels roll essays into themselves, right, and why that might be. And I was thinking a little bit about a novel like, I don't know, Ben Lerner's 1004, where you have sort of something that's been previously published as an essay embedded in the form of a novel. Well, why exactly is that? One answer might just be that these kinds of formal divisions or definitions seem to matter less and less in the literary marketplace, the commercial marketplace in which we all exist now. So I don't know that I don't know that those distinctions even matter as much anymore.
Though the existence of essays within the novel goes back to Woolf and Tristram Shandy and so on. I mean, you can take it back. Jeff, did you want to come back on, particularly on Katie's point?
Sure. Just it always seems useful to me in thinking about the essay to make that distinction between genre and mode, which is an Alistair Fowler distinction and has elsewhere. But the idea on the one hand of a genre, it's sort of an object that is of a particular kind, a novel, poem, whatever. And on the other hand, a mode, essaying or essayism, the ways in which any extended piece of writing might somewhere in the middle of it become essayistic. And I think there are so many different kinds of writing that get grouped together as essays that it's a somewhat hopeless project to say what unites all of them or to do much by way of family resemblance among all of them. But there is this essayism thing that Montaigne seems somehow to hold together for us, which is, I think, in Brian's word, a little bit light, a little bit contingent, exploratory, tentative. For me, that sense of trying is a little bit like trying a door, where you're exerting enough force to open it, but not enough to break it. You don't yet know the nature of its resistance. And so the trying is a kind of jiggling that's in between inertia, it's just waiting on one side of the door, and on the other side, sort of charging through it desperately. It makes it a minor form. It makes its politics, I think, characteristically oblique, questioning, unsloganing. But Lord knows there's need of a querying politics just now.
Yes. Yes, we're talking about light as opposed to heavy, I take it. Light, not light as opposed to dark. I mean, the two could be the same. I'm asking myself, if the essay is an essentially light genre, then what would be heavy? But,
you know, I heard when Brian, I couldn't over Zoom sort out at first whether you were saying lightness with a T or likeness with a K. But I think they really fit together. That is, that you've also used before, Brian, the word affinity to describe the way in which essays sort of hold themselves together. They're not love poems. They're like poems or like writing. And that kind of affinity is of their nature.
Yeah.
Yes. Who wants to come back? Katie, you want to come back in?
I was just going to say that I also misheard what Brian was saying initially, and thought that we were starting to think about the definitional problem of the essay in the ways that traditionally we go about it, by likening the essay to something else, or by reaching into its kind of metaphorical possibilities, like Jeff's lovely image of trying the door handle or trying the doorknob, if that was what the image was.
Yes. This is a very fruitful misunderstanding, Merve. Yes.
Well, I mean, this is to resurrect another question that came up earlier, which is why is it that so many people right now want to try to define the essay, right? Because we were talking a little bit before we started about just how many collections of essays on essays are being published right now. And so it seems like there's some urgency or there's some interest in doing that kind of intellectual work. And I would just be curious to hear from everybody what you think, why this moment?
What do you think is the answer?
No, I asked it, so I didn't have to answer it.
You don't have the answer.
Okay. I genuinely don't have the answer. No.
Right. Tommy, you have an answer.
Yeah, I think people move towards definitions as a way of trying to vindicate a form and license it, and people are looking for non-institutional forms of authority in writing. People want the authority to write, not with the authority of fiction, nor with the authority of the university, and they feel they may have found that in the essay. I think that's one of the main reasons why people now want to vindicate the form. By defining it. Not all people, but that's I would have thought that's one of the main reasons.
That's interesting. And I'm also very conscious of a sort of slippage of between institutional forms and maverick forms, and a slippage between different kinds of thinking about life writing in my field, where, you know, biography, autobiography, memoir are becoming increasingly jumbled together. Brian or Jeff, would you like to hazard a thought about why the essay is being so much defined, and indeed so many collections of this kind? I mean, I don't mean of this kind because this is unique, but so many collections coming out at the moment about the essay.
It does seem to me to have something to do with a desire on the part of the academy to be non-academic. And that to me is an extremely familiar desire, because it's the desire that led me originally as a PhD student in my mid-20s out of the academy and into something else that was at that point unnameable. And it was only a decade and a half later, when I started to think about writing what became my book, Essayism, that I started to own up to the idea that it was in fact the essay that I had been attempting to do in various modes, whether in memoir or in types of criticism or in journalism and reportage. And so I think that there is definitely this sense of a kind of, as I understand it from more strictly or more properly academic colleagues, a kind of exhaustion with modes of academic writing. But when I started that book, Essayism, almost 10 years ago, it was also coming out of, I think, for me, and this is why in a way I started with photography, a sense that visual art was a place in which certain kinds of writing, certain modes or moods of non-fictional writing were taking place. And so I would point to people like Sophie Calle or Moira Davey or Tacita Dean or the Otolith Group, artists, whether their work is primarily visual or textual, who seem to be working with some of the same purchase on reality, political or material, and at the same time a kind of a sense of wanting to elaborate an aesthetic that was hovering between text and image. So for me, now that maybe I'm only thinking through this right now in response to the question, I think it definitely came out of a different discipline. It came out of the visual arts.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Jeff, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, just briefly, I do think that the fact that the essay is being asked to do additional work now, especially as it circles through the academy, brings to bear an investment in definition. It's as though, the academy, of which I'm certainly a member, would say, if we're going to do this, we'd better have an account of what we're doing. We'd better have a definition, and it's such a perverse thing to do. That perversity has generated, this wonderful book. But the essay itself, insofar as we define essayism, it seems to be so kind of counter-definitional. It seems to be so evasive with respect to those sorts of stipulations. And so this very uncomfortable dance between the essay and accounts of the essay, in which the essay will always, I think, want to give them the slip, that itself being a definition. And to that, I'd only add, it's interesting to me to contrast that with the longer history of poetry trying to define itself, which seems more various. There are more different definitions of poetry and more sort of generative of the history of the enterprise than the same exercise has been for the essay.
Yeah, we've been talking about the shifts, the sort of historical shifts in the genre and its resistance or slippery evasiveness where it comes to definitions. I wanted to ask one more question of the panel, which is I've always felt that there was a sort of a necessity for the essay in some way to show its own originality. That you weren't supposed to write an essay unless you could in some way say something new or put something newly, or be in some way eccentric or maverick or peculiar or, original. I want to know whether you think that's important or whether you think that's gone away as an impulse behind the essay.
I think it remains, but it's interesting that we, whereas you might get away with being a poet and writing one epic poem, you'll never be an essayist if you write one essay.
Yes. Okay.
And so that problem of both having to make a new occasion of each essay, but also to find in the course of several of them a style which is recognizably yours, and which binds them together and in some sense not new, at least from your essay to your next essay. That's another one of these animating contradictions.
Right. Any other thoughts on that, or is that a red herring or dead end? Merve?
No, I was just thinking about an essay that I very much like, which was published in McSweeney's, called A Personal Essay by a Personal Essay. and it begins, I am a personal essay. I was born with a port wine stain and beaten by my mother. And it proceeds to list one traumatic encounter after another and reveals that the personal essay is in fact at an essay workshop where it is surrounded by other essays, and they all have names like the essay with alopecia or the divorce essay. And one of the arguments that I think that piece is making very nicely is how something like style has been subsumed by this infinitely receding horizon of subgenres that just kind of give you content, right? And I think it's hard, Hermione, to answer the question about idiosyncrasy or singularity or whatever without thinking about the environment in which essays are being produced now, which is that they are largely produced online. They are largely offering content, and the kind of content that they're offering is increasingly merging with the kind of content that all sorts of platforms are offering for personal self-definition. And so I suppose I'm just saying that I feel a little bit bleak about that as being what we will see defining the essay into the future.
Yes, and yet this book does not largely consist of writing about those sorts of products. No. This book consists of people who one can recognize because they are idiosyncratic, and that you don't get it from writing one essay, but you do get, you begin to you say, oh, that's very Montaigne, or that's very Baconish, so that there becomes an idiosyncratic, recognizable essay author. Yeah, sorry, Katie.
I just had a couple of contradictory kind of perspectives from the early essay on these questions, one of which is to say that all of our concern about the ubiquity of essays and memoir writing is something that Shaftesbury in 1711 is worrying about. And, he writes to say, the whole writing of this age has become a kind of memoir writing, and talks about the frothy distemper of essayists who are only wanting to expose people to things that have happened to themselves. So this kind of concern that we have about this kind of limitless idiosyncrasy is also happening in the longer history of the 17th century essay. And I think one of the answers to the question about why now for the essay is also a question about why then, and a question that I'm trying to think about at the moment.
Okay. Before we open this out to our audience, who I'm sure are going to be wanting to ask the panel lots of questions, can I just ask whether there's anything else that's come up in this bit of the conversation that any of you would like to say a bit more about? Brian, yeah.
Yes, I think so. I mean, this goes back partly to Merve's comments about the limitations of the kinds of formats, the kinds of platforms, the kinds of occasions for the contemporary essay. But it's also something that's been kind of hovering in my mind all through the conversation so far. And it's something to do with an idea of the essay as, we're talking in a way about a current mood that seems to be oriented to the essay. The essay is having a moment, we're always being told. I like to think of it instead as a kind of mood, and echoing Jeff's notion of the essay as a mode. If the essay is a mood, then it's something we recover from, right? It's something that we come back out the other side of. I always think about Wilde's great essay come dialogue, The Critic as Artist, where one of his interlocutors says, criticism is a mood. And when you have done with a mood, you move on, you get over it. And there is something about that sense of immersion, the sense of being obsessively locked in to a mood, unable to shrug it off, that's essential, I think, to the writing of an essay, and smuggling that mood into the kinds of formats and platforms, and not necessarily, but actually constricting formats that we live with is surely one of our tasks. But then we let it go. Then we have to start again.
You wanted to come back on that.
Can we perhaps ask Ellie to admit everybody to the chat function, because it'll take people a while to
write their messages. Questions. Please do, and we'll just finish off this conversation while they're speed writing their questions. Yeah, exactly. You want to come back then, Tommy?
I was just going to. Picking up on what Brian said, essayists I think are so often humorists in that they take. Often a slightly melancholy, detached position from the kind of more serious attachments of the world and its gravity. That goes back to the point about lightness. And I do think that there is a tradition within the essay that really values the raking over and restatement of established wisdom without wanting too much showy novelty. I mean, I think, Johnson defends that pretty vigorously as one of the purposes of the Rambler essays, to remind people of truths rather than to say anything new. And I think there's a lot of bristling in Montaigne about the desire of scholars for kind of showy novelty. And it does strike me, I mean, I remember if you look at Woolf's essay on being ill, there's a whole tradition of kind of mediocre late 19th century essays on being ill behind that essay, which she's rendering new. And it does strike me that, as with the lyric, there was a long tradition of mediocre light essays whose value I would defend in the same way I would defend the value of mediocre poetry and mediocre fiction, that being that it's an important cultural mode whose virtue in part is living through kind of important wisdoms. And that is one thing that would distinguish essays like lyrics, like novels, from, say, epics, which no one wants mediocre versions of.
I was thinking about Woolf also when Brian was talking about mood, and I like the way we've dealt with likeness and lightness and mood and mode. Woolf says that if she's feeling in need of a bit of sort of stiffening up, she'll go and read a little bit of one of her father's essays, which act on her, I'm slightly misquoting, like a dose of medicine. So there's that thing that we also need to read certain essays or want to go to certain essays because of the mood we're in. We need stiffening up, or we need cajoling, or, gossiping, or whatever. Any final thoughts from this part of the event from any of the panelists before we go to the questions?
Just one about mood. Emerson has some great line about how our moods do not know one another.
Yes.
But it seems like a term that collaborates with lightness, in the sense that we don't often think of an essay as being a passion, something that we suffer, something that is going to destroy the day when you read it, in a way that we might think of a poem or doing by virtue of some ecstatic interruption to which it aspires, or a novel that usurps you for the time that you're inside it. An essay is that funny thing that actually fits into it. It fit into Bacon's day, it fit into Montaigne's day, and it fits into our days. And mood as a sort of affective disposition which layers on top of life but doesn't displace it, also seems both sort of characteristic of the form and something that the form has to struggle to puncture.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I think I'm now going to thank everyone and become a member of the audience and pass over to Katie to negotiate with the questions. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Hermione. I've already written into the chat, but this is just to invite you personally to either signal your wish in the chat to ask a question by writing something like question. The local kind of practice in Oxford last year for Zoom questions was to write hand in the chat, but I understand that was specific to our locale. So any word which might signal your wish to ask a question, please drop it in the chat. Or if you're in a circumstance where you can't unmute yourself, then feel free to ask a question. In the meantime, the panel can keep talking to each other. Merve.
Well, I have a question for Brian about how he learned to write essays. I was so struck by you saying that you learned to write by looking at photographs, and that photograph that you showed us from the Didion piece. I mean, the word that kept coming to mind there was detail, right? The detail is so sumptuous. And then the way that she renders the detail of the objects in that room is so decadent. And I was wondering if there was something you wanted to say about detail and its relationship to style, because that was what I couldn't get out of my head when you were showing that picture.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it, or it's absolutely one of the aspects. When I first realized as a writer that I could stop occasionally writing book reviews and write about something else. It was first of all photography, and photography taught me exactly, as you say, to kind of tarry with the detail, to stay with something. Not only to be, as Katie made reference earlier on to Barthes and the punctum, not only to be kind of pierced by the surprise of the detail, but to move between apparently mundane details. I think that's one of the things that, for me, writing about objects and writing about images taught me to do was the value of the detail that actually seems not all that surprising, not all that piercing or lacerating, but needs to be described. And then the other thing that Didion does brilliantly in those captions already as a writer in her early 20s is to move between details and finding the gap, finding an elegant or seductive, or maybe it just needs to be invisible, pathway from one detail to the next is astonishingly difficult if the mode of writing that you've been trained in is one that is primarily, as I was, bringing concepts to bear on details. You always have a kind of backdrop of theory or of history, and to be able to be sort of nakedly, vulnerably trying to find your way from one detail in a picture or in the world to the next one, and not knowing how you do that. I think that's the training, and trying to find ways of risking that move. And it's down to the most mundane things, which is one of the things that Didion is so brilliant at talking about, is that literally how do you get yourself or your viewer, how do you get them to step across a room? It's that, which is also obviously a novelistic problem, right?
Great.
Suddenly have lots of questions.
We do. They've all started coming in. So the first question comes from Laurel Brake. Laurel, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself, you should feel free. But if not, I shall ask it for you. And this was prompted by the idea of the slipping of the essay, and the fact that many essays originate as journalism articles that are then inserted into literature, remediated as essays. So examples, essays in criticism, appreciations with an essay on style. And there's an ongoing slippage in academia between essays and articles. Is the essay the sign of literature rather than journalism? And does it still bear that history of remediation? So there's a lot that's rich in that about remediating, about what happens. And this is something actually that Mark Manellis's essay in our volume talks about, in the relation between the periodical essay appearing diurnally versus the publication as an anthology of essays. So I wonder if anybody has a response to that nexus of ideas. Any of the panelists, I mean.
I'm a little tempted to ask Merve about what it's like to be edited at the New Yorker, because that feels like there is a site of collision between sort of whatever vagrancy the sort of essayist may intend and a very strong institutional form.
Yeah. I mean, I will answer that question. I was just thinking in response to the immediate question that I would never use the term essay to describe a peer-reviewed article. I would always call it an article. I would never call it an essay. That would seem like a kind of misidentification of the genre. Jeff, to your question about being edited at the New Yorker, it is funny how one learns what the aspects of a house style actually are in very technical terms, right? So you can kind of identify a house style, but when you're being edited, you learn what that means. And it includes things like, even if you're writing a critic at large piece about a single author, like I just finished a piece on Mary Butts, whatever the book that was published that occasioned the review has to appear in like the first 3 paragraphs of the piece. And then you can go do whatever you want from there, but it has to appear. And that might seem minor, but it is a kind of constraint that makes you think about how the entire structure of the essay works. Or they have a very famous rule against indirection, which is that you can never introduce a concept without you can never introduce something that happened without sort of properly historicizing when in the person's life it happened. So chronology is super, super, super important. And these are all kinds of, they're just rules that you learn, and then you figure out how to play with them, right? And to the conversation we were having earlier about idiosyncrasy and style, part of the trick would seem to be learning how to operate within these constraints while also always pushing the boundaries of what is being imposed on you. But yeah, to get back to the original question, I would never think of those things as articles. They are always essays, or their reviews, or their criticism, right? And that's another term that comes into our discussion of essays, right? What's the difference between the essay and criticism?
It's interesting what Merve is saying about the ways in which writing for a particular or to a particular purpose constrains or channels your attention, or provides a kind of structuring of attention, which I think is in some ways generative for some people of a particular kind of essayistic writing. I should have emphasized earlier that if any of the contributors to the volume want to come in either as responders or as commenters on anything that's been discussed, you'd be particularly welcome. And I say this in part because I'm aware that Mark Manellis's essay touches on both that question that we've just had and the next question in the chat, which is about the ways that there are summaries at the end of the Pleiades Proust volumes. And if essays refuse to make themselves available to memory, would such a tool ever be useful for volumes of essays? Again, the reason I think partly of Mark Manellis's essay here is because that has a section on indexes, and indexes as finding tools which provide you with a different kind of map of the essayistic terrain. But I don't know, Jeff, if you have a response on memory to that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Useful for what? I think the essay would be sort of properly afraid of being displaced by the summary. That is, if that then became your account of what was in the essay and how you thought about it and how you talked about it. But one can imagine a sort of version of that summary at the end of an essay, which was well enough constructed in itself, but of questionable, even slightly questionable relation to what had gone before. It's a little bit like, if you'll forgive a digression into poetry, the little quatrains at the start of a canto of the Fairy Queen, which is a poem to which I'm unreasonably dedicated, which are always about what's about to happen, but not quite right. And so I think that the form of summary that would be most useful to the essay, qua essay, would be a summary that's not quite right.
And it's a different form of excerptability, isn't it? Rather than the sense of there being a portable section that could be removed, there's a sense of a kind of moving upwards in kind of viewpoint to miss detail. Merve.
Now, didn't The Believer used to do that in the essays that they ran? So right under the title would be like a version of what do you guys know that SNL skit with Stefan, right? This club has everything. The Believer would basically do a version of that underneath its title. So it would just list all of the various topics that came together within that essay. And I thought they were often being chosen to seem as deliberately unrelated to one another as possible, to create a sense of total capaciousness for what that essay was going to accomplish.
Yeah. Brian. Yeah. You're muted.
Apologies. I always thought that habit at The Believer was in part a parody of what happens when you look up in the New Yorker archive an essay or a piece from the past, and you find that there is a strange summary that is partly a list. It's partly a list of topics covered, and it's partly an excerpt. It's very oddly worded, and it's almost a kind of, if we're thinking about a publication like the New Yorker, it's almost a kind of subgenre within the New Yorker essay itself. And it raises, or these kinds of summaries and these kinds of paratext raise a whole question about the boundaries of the essay, about where it stops. You know, one of the ways in which the academic article aspires to a kind of essayism is by attaching epigraphs to itself, right? It might be all you have as a scholar. It might be your one gesture. But there is a question about what happens around the edges, what kinds of paratexts, what kinds of matter attach to the essay, where its edges are.
Yeah, absolutely important. It's kind of boundary territories might be thought to be. Great. There's an essay here about, Merve used the phrase didactic essay. Is that a form which still exists? Can modern essayists be didactic? And if not, what is the list of the lost species of the essay? What has disappeared? One thing that occurs to me that has not entirely disappeared, but which was very dominant in the kind of late 17th, early 18th century, and which is not so much in use, is the dialogic essay, the essay written as a dialogue between two personae. And the essay written in general, if we have personal essays, we have far fewer personae essays these days, I think, far few that are written under a persona. But Merve, I don't know if you want to respond to the question about didacticism.
I mean, I'll answer the question about lost genres, which is to say, I sort of fell down a rabbit hole looking at early 20th century composition textbooks, which are incredibly interesting in how they are trying to teach essay writing to first-year undergraduates, right? Because that's the other form of essay that we haven't really spoken about, is the pedagogical essay. We all teach these kinds of essays, don't we? And you know, in the early 20th century, particularly as education was increasing, or access to education was increasing, there was just this glut of composition textbooks being produced to help standardize the way that people taught writing and the genres in which they taught writing. And so I think if you go back to those, then you find not only the didactic essay, but the factual essay. There's a question in the Q&A, Katie, about facts, isn't there? You find the factual essay, the instructive essay. And so I imagine that there are a great many genres that have disappeared because they are not being reproduced in classrooms, say.
In lots of ways, you're responding to a question which has just appeared from Ella Barker about the institutional context of the essay. And this question points out that Ella is not sure that the essay is a non-institutional authority, especially if by institution we mean the university, where in which the essay seems to be from which the essay seems to be inextricable. And Ella wants to know what we think about the essay in relation to the university and its various historically specific guises and genres. And there's another kind of institutional question from Susan Greenberg about the relationship between the essay and nonfiction and journalism. So that's an extra institutional relationship. But there are two questions about, you know, what is happening at the edges of the essay and others. Tommy, I think I saw your hand there.
Yeah, I was just going to say some, but not all, of this confusion that we seem to use the word essay now to refer to what we might think of as two different and opposite things. One being digressive, free, non-institutional, the other being the sort of things we were taught to write at school with the pre-made structure, arises from the fact that we now use the word essay for what was once called the theme, which, as I understand it, is a term which still exists, or still existed until recently in America, but disappeared in the late 19th century in Britain. And the theme was very clearly had a much more generic structural form. But I think that it's not really a case of two opposite things which happen to share the same word. And actually, that those two opposite things that we call essays are always playing off of one another. The essay points up, celebrates, flaunts its digressiveness, its individuality, and its flair by messing with expectations which are quite conscious and quite apparent, and which are borrowed from the school essay. by which I mean school and university. And something of the converse might be true too. I'll stop there.
Great. Jeff, do you want to come in?
Just with respect to those last couple of questions, it feels like if one were to try to define a didactic essay, it might be didactic by virtue of the fact that it knows in advance what it has to teach and is structured to fulfill that ambition. And that this might be a question of, in a sense, where the trying lies. That the sort of, and we know many glorious examples of fully foreknowing essays. They're not trying to do what they do, they're doing it, and they're asking their reader to try to master the subject we're about. That's an essay, perhaps without essayism. The essayistic essay is the one that has the trying inside itself, that is its student and its teacher at the same time.
Yeah. I am going to invite, Amanda Grimswell-Roswell raised a hand. And I don't know if you are still there, if you want to come in.
I'm still here.
Great. Hi.
Hi, thank you. I'll just be quick. I'm a PhD student in Denmark, and I'm doing a project on the contemporary feminist essay. And I'm very interested in the form of the essay. So I know, because I read the first chapter, the introduction of your very beautiful book. And I understand that you want to talk about the essay as something very miscellaneous, or putting together all sorts of forms. And I don't disagree in that, but I'm still very interested in how conditions for publishing, social, economical perspective has shaped the genre during the years from Montaigne's essays onto today. And I thought maybe one of you had thoughts about that. If not, it's also totally fine. I'll go figure it out. Thank you.
No, thank you for your question. Thoughts? Brian, yeah. Brian, you're muted.
I do keep doing that. I do apologize. Just one very brief thought, which kind of links back to some of what's also happening in our earlier questions in the chat, is that, yes, of course, the essay has historically, in its most caricatured fashion, been a kind of gentlemanly genre, and that this remains the case in all the ways that we could predictably point to. At the same time, what we call essays come from all kinds of different unexpected places, and one of them is polemic. One of them is surely polemical journalism. The relationship of the essay not only to the venerable forms of the sermon and so on, but to the rant, to the screed and so on, is undeniable. And you would have to say that in the period of the great essayists of the second half of the 20th century, the people that everybody, including I, won't stop going on about, like Didion and Sontag and Elizabeth Hardwick, the most prominent female essayists of that period are feminist writers, and mostly highly polemical writers. I think that probably the first writers I ever read when I was still at high school, who I would now have to say were essayists, were people like Germaine Greer, were people who had a kind of public profile that once I found collections of their journalisms, I thought, oh, hang on, there's something else happening here that's in the writing. And I think that has been strangely kind of smoothed out in a certain kind of history of the essay of recent decades.
Yeah, Merve, did you want to?
Well, I just to Amanda, I think if I were, that sounds like a fascinating project, first of all. And I think if I were writing it, or if I were reading it, one thing I would be interested in is to compare the essayists that Brian names to people writing in collectives, writing manifestos at the same time. right? Because that is the time when you have a kind of explosion in feminist collectives writing manifestos with very sort of clear utopian ideas about what it is to write, not as an individual essayist, but as one among many voices that blend together without completely obliterating the differences between the speakers. So that would seem to me, at least, to be an interesting nexus of comparison, would be the essay versus the manifesto as a feminist project. And my immediate impulse would be to say that the essay is going to map onto a kind of liberal feminist imagination, and the manifesto is going to give you something more radical and possibly even more experimental.
Great. I'm about to read out a comment and question from Cara Whitman. Hello, Cara. James Whitehead, I'm going to invite you, possibly, if you feel able, to deliver your question in person, because I'm not confident of my ability to summarize it. But if you don't feel able, just put that in the chat and I will attempt to summarize it properly. But Cara's observation is that something else that's having a moment at the moment is amateurism. The interest of professionals in being amateurs or inhabiting the amateur spirit. And Brian's comment, presumably your comments on writing, coming into this as an amateur, looking with trepidation at the scholarly interest in the form, inspired this. Both Edward Said and Roland Barthes at different moments celebrate the amateur as what an intellectual should always already be in order to remain, for Said, critical, or for Barthes, in the productive space of the as if. Are these moments of a piece, she asks? Is this perhaps related to the discussion of liking, the amateur having permission to love something? Lots of really interesting thoughts there. I can see Jeff nodding. Jeff, do you want to articulate your nod, or is the nod a gesture, pure and simple?
It's a gesture. I'll follow it up. Yes, it does feel as though, trying and amateurism are close together, and I sat in yesterday actually on a class taught by one of our contributors, Christy Wampole, who's sort of teaching an essayism class, and one of the things that was sort of discussed around the table was how one should train to be an essayist, and whether it's something that you should do in graduate school. Is it part of that professional training? Is the ideal professional training for an academic learning to write Bach fugues before you sort of compose what you compose? Or can you sort of leap into this form that is already amateur before you've become a professional? And I don't introduce that to answer the question, except to say that I'm pretty interested in the category of the amateurism of experts. That is what it is for someone who has an expertise and has cultivated that under the discipline of institutions to exceed or evade that kind of training. That feels to me like a special and an interesting category.
Great. Marvi, did you want to come in on that question?
Hi, Cara. How are you? I mean, I don't know. I feel very skeptical about the celebration of amateurism, although Jeff kind of rescued it by yoking it to experts. So, because I was precisely going to say that I suppose I worry that ideas of amateurism, particularly in essay writing, particularly today, go along with a kind of de-skilling of the work that is done that really, really, really worries me. And so I feel a little bit allergic to that celebration of amateurism. I think I'm someone who is really invested, particularly within our profession, of there being certain kinds of expertise and it being very important to stress what that expertise is and the kinds of sort of unique knowledge that it can generate that others outside of the profession cannot, which is my probably horridly conservative answer, but it is what it is. It's how I feel.
Tommy, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I was just going to make a distinction between teaching and training. Jeff used the word training, and training is something that professionals and experts are brought up in. And it goes back to that question of the potential didacticism of the essay, and whether that's a didacticism that trains or teaches. So I want to stick up for amateurism as a teaching which isn't a training. Because I think the virtue of genres which are capable of training us is that they can make intuitive kinds of intellectual and artistic maneuvers which are powerful and which can be built on. The virtue of a kind of didacticism, which is a teaching and not a training, is that it leaves you free to inquire into the meaning of those kind of instinctive movements. The risk of professionalism is that the concentration, which is its virtue, can start to become a closed field and exclude new possibilities of thought and new discourses into marrying. So the essay and the amateurism both have the functions in cultural and literature in opening up those closed fields and carving windows into those kind of zones of concentration.
Yeah, I suppose I'll call on you in a second, Brian, but one thing from the historical perspective, one of the answers that I give myself to the question of why is the essay so kind of super abundant in the 17th and early 18th centuries, when there are well over 1,500 books published with essay in the title, and then in parallel with the profusion of essays now, is the extension of the terrain of who gets to be expert in an etymological sense, of who gets to have had experience from which they can then speak. And I think both for technological reasons and for reasons of the move of discourse into the vernacular, and all kinds of extension happen in the 17th century, which mean that the people who are able to speak from a position widen. And I think that kind of merges what expertise and amateurism are in some sense. But I think there's a parallel there. Sorry, Brian, I spoke over you.
No, quite all right. Just to say, I mean, I suppose that one of the things that perhaps we risk losing when we talk about amateurism and expertise is the specific transformation that happens in writing, and we are all in our own ways amateurs at writing, whether we have an academic or other kind of expertise, or whether we come as merely amateurs. But I'm also struck by a figure who's lurking behind this conversation about amateurism and expertise, and that figure is the curioso, the 16th and 17th century professional amateur. And an idea of curiosity is surely also one of the things that animates the essay historically, for good and ill. You know, the curioso is a scientist, but also, and is parodied in the 17th century as the figure who is excessively attached to small things, who risks always, in the mode of his knowledge, a kind of frivolity. And so I just wonder if there is a kind of lurking sense of curiosity as a value here, but also as a risk. You know, when we elevate these terms, amateurism and curiosity, I think we do risk some of the things that Merve has already pointed to. They also risk becoming just kind of boring. To be honest, you know, there's a sense in which the elevation of the amateur and the elevation of curiosity as a value, and also perhaps of the essay as a value, is a bit basic at some level. You know, it's a bit boring and ordinary and generalized. And we always, in these discussions, just as in the practice of the essay, have to keep coming back to its difficulties, to its contradictions, to the labor of it. And that's why I say, you know, at the same time, that maybe a kind of lightness in our attachment to the very idea of the essay, or our own expertise, or our amateurism, or our curiosity is essential, because growing too attached to these terms, and just as much as these genres, distracts us from the difficulty of it all, which is writing. That in itself is an utterly banal and sort of sentimental way to put things. Sorry.
It reminds me of a conversation we had at another event, Brian, about what it is we like about ourselves when we say that we like essays. You know, what is it that we are enjoying about ourselves when we identify ourselves as essayistically inclined people. I was also thinking there about a kind of subgenre. This is a swerve. I apologize. A subgenre of essay in which I'm particularly interested, which relates to the kind of miscellaneousness and to the conversation we were having earlier about headings of summaries. There's a kind of rare subgenre of essay which tends to describe the contents of the stomach of a whale, for example, or the contents of a buried urn, or whatever it may be, as a kind of miscellaneous holding object. And the essay itself stands in as a kind of holding object of those various kinds. Jeff, go ahead, and then I will kind of dissect several questions at once.
Only the briefest gloss on Brian's sense of labor, because Brian, I'm haunted by a sentence that's at the end of the Essayism book, where you think of that, you describe the task as being to write while writing, and that's as good a description of how hard it is as I know.
And that relates actually to one of the comments. There's a lot of excellent thinking going on in the comments, incidentally, and some wonderful phrasing. And I will save the chat, or I'll ask Ellie to save the chat so that we don't lose any of that, because I'm about to do it all violence by cutting out to individual keywords from individual people's questions. But there is a question somewhere which speaks directly to what you were saying about the kind of self-conscious writerly writing, the writing that is aware of itself as writing, and whether that's specifically essayistic or whether it might be something that other genres do as well. There are several questions which are related to kind of distinguishing the essay from things on which it borders. So Jason Childs asks, how do we distinguish the term essayistic from experimental? One of the arguments I would make in my own contribution to this volume is we can't, but that's that's not for everybody to say. But how do we distinguish the term essayistic from experimental? There's a question about James Whitehead has condensed his question down to, is it important to the essayist to be a good forgetter as well as memorable and original? And I think that's something that speaks directly to Jeff. And Denis Topalovich has asked about the association between ambulatory or wayfaring modes and essayists. Why are essayists such avid walkers or travelers? I'm bombarding you simultaneously with 3 slightly different questions because I'm aware that we're shortly to run out of time. Anyone have any direct responses to those things?
I would only say very, very briefly that, yes, I absolutely agree about the wayfaring ambulatory essayists, but there are probably just as many examples of essayists who will not get out of bed. and essayists who simply don't want to leave their room.
Yeah, as ever, the essay operates at both poles of whatever contradiction might be in operation. Jeff?
Just to refer the essay and experiment question to Katie's essay in the volume and her thinking generally about the relationship among between the words experiment and experience in the 16th and 17th centuries and down to our moment. There's a passage there where they're indistinguishable, and experience can have a transitive form or transitive sense, and the abiding difficulty of separating out the active and passive senses of that word feels like it has something to do with our subject.
Yeah, I would agree.
Can I just come in again? That question from Jason Childs, I think it was, about the experimental nature of the essay, started by talking about there's something to be said precisely for the essayist not knowing what he or she has to say, or knowing its value in advance. And we haven't used the word improvisation, I don't think. And I'm just curious to know what other people feel about whether they think that the essay is a place where people don't know where they're walking to until they've walked there, or don't know where they're going. Do we think that the essay is a form of improvisation whereby you start off without knowing where you're going, even if you're in bed, as it were?
I have a two-headed answer to that, one of which is yes, and the other of which is, but then you have, and Jeff quoted partly from this earlier, the essayist going to their own essay as a reader, revising, adding, so that when one is reading Montaigne, one has no idea if it's, well, unless one is reading a modern edition, which of the temporal strata one is entering at. So the impression of aimlessness sometimes is atemporal and emerges from the essay's kind of varied texture rather than from the linearity of its exposition. I think both Jeff and Brian were coming in.
I was only going to agree, really. I think that performing your not knowing is one of the tricks of the essay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that some sort of original pressure to distinguish those two words, experience and experiment. Experiment becomes a mode of inquiry that specifies quite narrowly what it wants to know and what will count as that knowledge. And science travels with the experiment and travels far, and the essay travels with experience as distinct from the controls that make an experiment.
And I think the essay is also interested in a kind of Atalanta's golden apples scenario where the subject of the essay is almost kind of tossed into the path of the essay's onward momentum as a proxy object of attention that can generate some more curiosity and interest. I think being distracted is precisely part of the purpose. Merve.
This is another New Yorker rule, though, that you never want to be like Atalanta looking for her golden apples. Actually, explicitly, you do not, you need to keep moving, right? You never want to be like Atalanta looking for her golden apples. I've had that said to me twice now.
Wow. So some of my favorite essays are,
I'm sure.
Atalanta's stumbling over golden apples.
I mean, but this just gets back to the conversation about institutionality, right? Like that it really isn't an anti-institutional genre, that different institutions set different standards or normalize different standards for what their essays are. And one of the lines that you and Tommy have in your introduction that's so striking to me is about the college admissions essay, which, if you're thinking about it just in terms of scale, is probably the most popular, the most prolific genre of essay produced, right? It's probably something like, 4 or 5 million a year. And so I think one of the things that you always have to do if you're thinking historically about the essay is think about everything that needs to exist in order for the idiosyncratic writers that come out in this book to win their idiosyncrasy, right? From the vast bulk of undifferentiated stuff.
Yeah.
That does not appear here.
I think that's a beautifully aphoristic way to draw things to a close, especially since we're now at 5 to 7. I'm aware of not having done justice to some wonderful comments and questions. And as I said, if Ellie were able to save the chat, and then we'll scrub all the personal messages that have been going in between individuals, and then we'll be able to keep that. And I'll hand over to Tommy.
Yes, thank you, everything. Picking up on Merve's final comment, one of the things that the kind of the highly literary or pleased with itself connotation of the essay does is to try to camouflage what we will know, which is the kind of deep roots of the essay in our pedagogical experience, much more obviously so than in the case of the other genres, but all literature comes out of kind of pedagogical structures in any era. And that sends me back gives me my opportunity to encourage you all to buy that school textbook on essays at a magnificently affordable £14. If you are using, if you are using the flyer for discount that OUP have very kindly given us, and I think it might be possible to get a gold tip pen and a spider pencil case for another £1. So I will encourage you to do that and remind you in schoolmistressly fashion that Chrome does not work for the purpose, but Safari and Firefox do. So I want to thank all of you so much. It's been the most magnificent conversation. Katie and I couldn't be more honored to have had such wonderful participants in the conversation and such a wealth of questions from the floor. And I hope we all get a chance to meet again. And when I say all, I mean the contributors and all the people who showed their interest by coming along. Hopefully, like essays, this will be the beginning of a conversation and not the full stop to one. So with that, I'll place a full stop to this dialogue and thank everyone and end the Zoom session.
Thank you, contributors.
Bye-bye.